you were mentioning this, your intensity of effort's very high. You're really good at pushing yourself to failure when necessary or needed. Maybe
Yeah,
necessary is not the right word, but when
it's a good word.
yeah, it's a good word. Okay. But let's talk about that because you mentioned you could be so depleted, so drained after it can affect your whole day if you don't time your workouts in the right way. I noticed you also follow Paul Carter. Paul
Yes,
Carter,
I've been
right?
following him, God, for at least a decade by now, when he used to have his
Okay.
Lift from Bang blog,
Wow.
because he used to do
So,
powerlifting content. That's why I follow him back in the day.
okay. Okay. What's your experience with high reps, low reps, and fatigue? Kind of the stuff that he's
My
been putting out.
So I figured this out years ago without even looking at the data that low reps generally work best.
Mm.
When I would do high reps, I'd be overly fatigued for the rest of the workout, and my upcoming sets, there'd be a massive drop off in performance. And I never felt like it worked that well for me, except for a calisthenics context where that's basically your default. But the thing is, I do acknowledge that if you go to failure with these higher rep sets and you have the work capacity to tolerate it, which you would have if you did GPP work and full body workouts, which we talked about in our first discussion,
Yeah.
if you have that necessary fitness base, then it's totally doable. There's no difference. If I do a set of 20 to failure, that'll build just as much muscle as a set of 8. But the difference is when you do low reps, you don't have to take the set to failure. You can leave a rep or two in the tank and you have high motor unit recruitment from rep one. Whereas with the high rep sets, you do have to get to failure or at least one rep in reserve. Like you can't be leaving reps in the tank because it's only towards the end where you're truly fatigued enough that you recruit all the high threshold motor units. Basically, if I do a set of 30 and I stop at rep 20, even though it was still a difficult set, quote unquote, it's not going to equate to hypertrophy outcomes than if I did 10 reps, but maybe I had like 12 in me, for example.
I think also because they were mentioning this, Chris Beardsley, and I tuned into some of those episodes on the podcast there. They were talking about how with the high rep work, where obviously it's just going to be more painful, like as the
That's
reps
the problem.
accumulate.
Well, that's why
And
I
then,
said,
yeah, yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
sorry to cut you off.
No, no.
That's why I said you need to have the work capacity and the pain tolerance to do it. Now, some people are sickos like myself. Like my
Mm.
base was calisthenics. I did it for like 3 years. So asking me to do a set of 30, no problem. I've done sets of 50 with calisthenics and arguably two failure. So if you're able to push through that pain, which I argue most people don't have the pain tolerance because even when it comes to a set of 10, they freaking don't go to failure. I never see
Yeah,
it in
yeah.
any gym. Then you're asking for trouble with the higher reps. Not that it can't be done, it absolutely could be, but you actually have to put in the necessary effort. And I think filming yourself is a great litmus test because what I can tell you is if there's no bar speed slowdown, if there's no ounce of grinding whatsoever, if it just suddenly stopped and you're saying, oh, that's my failure, not really. You're kind of being dishonest or you're just unaware, unless you're super explosive. But the thing is, you would see it on the last rep that there'd be a slight sticking point. It's not going to look the same as your first
Yeah,
rep.
yeah.
Like, man, I get comments all the time like, Alex, how are you able to grind so much on your sets? And my immediate response is, how are you not grinding like this every single week if you claim to be training hard or
Mm.
training to failure? They're like, oh, I go to failure as well, and I never grind like you. Well, man, you're not training to failure. It's that
It's pretty
simple.
much
You're
simple.
probably
Yeah.
training at a rep in reserve, and that's fine. You don't need to train to failure. That's actually been one of my revelations in the last year or so. And even Paul Carter has talked about this, right? It
Yeah.
creates additional fatigue that's not necessary. And when
Yeah.
I was doing that, I swear to God, man, I need an extra day of rest. So my classic recommendation for years has always been 72 hours split between strenuous sessions. But when I was doing the failure only training, it was 96. And I document everything. I film my stuff year round and I noticed that. So I've stopped doing it. It's usually a rep in the tank or true failure on my last set, if that. And I feel a lot better for it. So 1 to 2
Yeah.
RIR, you go back to your roots. But I'm still sticking to the two sets approach.
Okay. Before you dive into that, for those listening, to be clear, this one rep in reserve is sub 8 reps, we'll say. Is that accurate to say, Alex? Like you're not doing high reps with one rep in
No,
reserve,
no,
or are
no.
you? Okay. Okay.
No. I cap it like on the compound movements, I cap it to 10 reps.
Okay.
But my
Gotcha.
favorite rep range is 5 to 8.
Yeah, so they're good. That's what I thought. Because the higher reps you go, if you're going to play that game, which can be more fatiguing if you haven't adapted, because you mentioned if you're adapted to it and you're a bit of a psychopath in
It
that
can be done.
regard, it can be
But
done.
like,
But I don't think, and you can chime in here. Sorry, I want to get this out. It is still more fatiguing, I think, than the lower reps on your central nervous system.
I would agree to that. All
Okay.
things being equal, even though on paper you can get the same hypertrophy outcomes, I still think it's more fatiguing. And I think most people are better off sticking to a low to moderate rep range. There's no reason to go above that unless you're doing calisthenics or movement that maybe you want to spare the joints a bit, like a tricep push down. You don't want to be doing 90 pounds on the V bar. Maybe you'll drop it down to 50 pounds with a dual rope. And now you got the biomechanical factors lined up. So your elbows are going to thank you and you'll get 15 to 20 reps. But you don't care if there's a drop off because it's just a little isolation movement, right? So I think in those cases, it's helpful. The other layer is, there's all this talk about the way to stretch. And I've been on that train as well since 2016, 2017, before the science came out. And I
Yeah.
always said it was going to catch up. So yeah, that's great. It's optimal, quote unquote, but it's also harder to recover from. So if all you do is lengthen work and you don't mix in, like, I wouldn't tell someone to just do cambered bar bench press. Even though you're getting a better stretch on the pecs, more range of motion, etc., it's also going to tax your shoulders more, and you won't be able to do as much frequency on your bench, or it might take an extra day to recover. And in the long term, that could add up. Now, if you follow an asynchronous split, you might not care, right? But if you want someone who has consistent days, you're benching on Mondays and Fridays, well, maybe just doing a regular range of motion one day and then extended the next is a good way to blend that. I don't agree with this idea that we should only do lengthened work and that the shortened position is worthless, or that the mid work is somehow that much worse than the lengthened. Usually it's comparable. Like an exercise that has high progression potential and is stable, but it's mid-range focus as opposed to lengthened, will probably have identical gains or close enough to it for most people. And Dr. Milo Wolf, the mastermind behind the lengthened position, right? Like the partials rather, he admitted in one of our interviews that it's at most 10% more effective. So that's what we're
Mm.
talking about here, which could be nice if you're an advanced natural bodybuilder trying to milk out those extra gains and you understand fatigue management and all that. But the average lifter is probably not going to see the gains that social media is hyping it out to be. So listen, in my experience as someone who's bench 405 at 185, not too many people can do that. In no way would I ever do exclusively extended range of motion presses. I wouldn't be able to recover from it. And it would slow down my progress, if anything. Like just the other day, I'm doing board presses, like a half board or one board, just so that my shoulders have a little bit of a break when I'm overloading,
Yeah, yeah. Just to minimize that lengthened position a little bit there.
Sometimes you want to,
Yeah, yeah,
but I
for sure.
still think lengthened work
Mm.
should be included. Anything in the mid to lengthen with a little bit of shorten here and there is probably the way to go. It doesn't have to be lengthened only for every single exercise.
I was gonna say this because obviously the shortened work is way less fatiguing. Like I
Way
can
less.
recover the next day and go in and start training
That's the
again.
whole
That's the
benefit.
funny thing. But if we're talking about strictly hypertrophy, yeah, okay, I understand that's a different thing. But there's also cons to the lengthened work. If you're not careful with the execution, that's a great place to tear muscles, right? Like you got to be very on point with execution, the right
Well,
loading. So yeah, go
what I
ahead.
would say
Sorry.
to that though, if you're doing like extreme lengthened work, the reduction in load would probably equate the injury rates. So I think it's more so that you're increasing muscle damage. And if you're not managing that fatigue, that's what could possibly contribute to injuries. But if you do recover between sessions, then I don't think the risk is any higher. And I would also say that if you're natural, that risk is greatly diminished because your tendons
Mm.
will always be developing in a similar rate to your muscles. And the best example, you're not supposed to do this, but I was maxing out during my recent cut. Even at single digit body fat, I maxed out on the bench and I've never been worried about tearing my pec because I've built my tendons over time in those deep ranges of motion. I would argue that the lengthened work can reduce injuries when you do normal range of motion after. So if you're doing deficit push-ups, extreme weighted dips where your pecs are being stretched out to the max, and then you move on to something that's more mid-range, then you can argue that you'll never get hurt doing that stuff. It's like the cambered bar makes your normal bench feel like a board press. So I think if we look at it through that lens, that we're less fragile than we think we are, and that lengthened work can be used to reduce injuries and actually build deep end mobility, I think that's an encouraging message.
It is. I'm glad you brought that up. I'm not trying to
Oh no, I'm not trying to say that you implied that, but I
yeah.
just wanted to bring it up.
Of course, no, that's really good. And the reason why I brought that up specifically was because I've seen people, and this happens a lot, but execution gets quite sloppy. And if you're doing that in the lengthened position and you have
Oh
things like
yeah,
inertia coming into play, there's excessive
definitely. Well,
forces
that's why
that can,
Dr.
yeah,
Mike, he says you want to
yeah.
ease into the stretch, right? It's funny though. There's like two perspectives on this. On one end, you have
Hmm.
Menno Henselman saying you want to increase the negative speed because then the way to stretch is going to be magnified. You're really going to feel that pulling, and it's going to like rip you apart, right? In a good way.
Hmm.
And that's kind of what we see like in Olympic weightlifting. If we talk about the traps, right? Like if you're doing a low pull, which is essentially a power shrug, right? You're squeezing very briefly, but then you're catching it the acceleration is so fast, you just feel everything pulling apart, and that's hypertrophic as hell, right? But at the same time, you could argue that that increases injuries, and I would say it probably does. I probably wouldn't do it for the chest. For the
Yeah.
legs, I mean, look, Olympic weightlifters, they do acid grass all the time, with heel elevation and you're maximally stretching the quads. I don't think it's a problem.
And it's sport specific, right? Like that's like,
Yeah,
yeah, so that's also a different thing, like versus someone who's just doing it for bodybuilding and maybe health as part of the equation,
yeah.
right?
But
So
there's some nuances here, but I do think
yeah.
most people shouldn't be rushing it unless they have some specific strength goal. It probably does increase injury risk and for no added benefit. Plus, you're having to lift heavier than is required for hypertrophy. Because the thing is, if you slow down that negative, you're getting the same hypertrophic stimulus, but with less weight. So you can maintain the same proximity to failure, the same rep ranges. All that could be constant, but now your form is standardized. You're easing into the stretch. You're just making things better overall.
And for those who do they want to play that game for whatever reason, like with the speed stuff, there's some equipment that can make a lot of sense for. I don't know if you're familiar with this, Alex, but like some of the Keiser equipment, the pneumatic stuff, like it's literally air, like you pump the
Yes,
air.
yes. So
Yeah,
yeah, it's funny you
yeah.
mentioned that. Yeah,
That stuff works really well if you want to do this high velocity type work and you don't get this
yeah,
additional inertia that can get quite excessive in the extreme ends of range where, yeah,
yeah,
arguably that could be
yeah.
more risky, right?
And I would also throw in bands into that equation because actually, in this case, the eccentrics are faster than the speed of gravity because they're rebounding so quickly that in this case, you would think it promotes injuries, but rather it eliminates them because you're building the connective tissue. And this is one of the secrets that John Quint used to talk about with the West Side athletes. You notice that they had fewer rates of injuries in the areas where they were doing a lot of band work. It was also a theory of Dr. Mel Siff, the author of Super Training, that if you
Hmm.
use bands, it can potentially override the Golgi tendon organ, but more specifically, it builds the connective tissue through reducing muscular tension, but still getting that blood flow in and movement pattern.
That's what you were mentioning that with your elbow. Like that really helped you with
Oh
your
man,
because you had the hypermobile elbows, right?
yeah, yeah, and that's
Yeah, yeah, we
why
talked about that.
people
Yeah.
we did, yeah, and what cured it for me was very high rep band pushdowns, like doing sets of 50 with a mini band. Like you're going so fast that the set's done in like that, right?
Hmm.
But you get a nasty pump in your triceps and you're still getting full range of motion and it cures elbow pain. Because if there's anyone who should have problems, it's me. And yet I'm the one maxing out on close grip bench press with 90 pounds of chains. I'm doing all this crazy stuff. I should have been injured a decade ago. And yet I don't have elbow issues. So I think there's something to be said about it.